She fled the storm into my shelter, then stopped cold at the sight of a human. Small storms flared up unpredictably, tossing dust and debris across the jagged terrain. Humans had called this place Aridex 7, a name chosen more for practicality than poetry. For Ethan, who had been stationed here for several weeks as part of a scientific survey, it was home for now, a home defined by survival, solitude, and careful planning. Ethan moved through the dunes with practiced ease, his boots sinking into the hot, shifting sand. His light cloak flapped behind him in the rising wind. He kept his eyes on the horizon, aware that weather on Aridex 7 could change without warning. In the distance, dark clouds gathered, growing quickly into something more dangerous. He had seen storms form like this before, but the speed of this one was unusual. He turned back toward his shelter, a small dome made of reinforced alloy and insulated against heat, cold, and high winds. Every panel had been tested to survive electrical storms, and every hatch sealed against dust and sand. Still, Ethan knew that no structure was completely safe against nature at its worst. He increased his pace, feeling the first stabs of sand sting his face and hands. By the time he reached the shelter, the storm was already upon him. A wall of dust and wind rolled over the dunes, blotting out the sun. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the desert in brief flashes, followed by the deep rumble of thunder that shook the ground. Ethan hurriedly secured the entrance hatch, sliding it closed just as the wind whipped around him with full force. Inside, the shelter was calm and warm compared to the chaos outside. Lights hummed quietly, instruments blinked, and the air filtration system whirred, keeping out dust and sand. Ethan wiped the sweat and sand from his brow and took a deep breath. Alone in his little bubble of safety, he ran through his usual checklist: power levels, water supply, emergency rations. The storm would last for hours. Then came the sound of movement at the door. At first, Ethan thought he had imagined it. Wind can make odd noises. But then he saw a shadow, a figure staggering against the harsh gusts. He froze, unsure what he was seeing. The shape grew clearer, illuminated briefly by a streak of lightning. It was not human. The figure was tall, slender, with smooth, pale skin that shimmered faintly in the flickering light. Its limbs were long, and its movements were cautious but desperate. Ethan's heart thumped in his chest. He had never seen a living being like this before, at least not in person. His scientific curiosity battled with caution. He activated the shelter's external lights and slowly opened the hatch a crack. The figure froze immediately, as if sensing the change. Then, almost instinctively, it crouched lower, eyes wide, staring at him. Its eyes were large, reflective, and a deep, shifting color that reminded him of desert glass. Ethan held up a hand in a gesture of peace, careful not to startle it further. "Hey, it's okay," he said softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." The alien blinked, tilting its head slightly, studying him. Ethan noticed its chest rise and fall rapidly. It was breathing hard, exhausted from the storm outside. Slowly, he opened the hatch wider, motioning toward the interior of the shelter. "Come in," he said gently. "You need shelter. It's dangerous out there." For a long moment, the alien hesitated. Then, in a sudden burst of courage or desperation, it stepped forward, brushing past the threshold. The storm gusted behind it, and a cloud of sand blew into the shelter, but Ethan was quick to slam the hatch shut again. The alien paused, shaking off the dust. It looked around the interior with cautious curiosity, eyes wide at the unfamiliar human technology. Ethan stepped back, giving it space, and held out his hand in another sign of peace. "My name is Ethan," he said. "I'm a human. You're safe here." The alien's gaze lingered on him. Its face, if it could be called that, was expressive, showing a mixture of fear, astonishment, and something that might have been curiosity. Ethan could feel the tension in the room, thick and heavy, like the air before a storm. He moved toward the storage locker and brought out a small supply of food and water. He had little idea what this alien could eat, but he hoped it might be able to survive on some basic nutrients. He set the containers down carefully, keeping his distance. The alien moved cautiously, sniffing and examining the food. It didn't touch it at first, but eventually, with a small, hesitant motion, it began to consume a few pieces. Ethan watched silently, giving it time. "I know this is strange," he said. "I know you didn't expect to see a human. I didn't expect to see you either, but we're both just trying to survive the storm." The alien's breathing slowed slightly, and it seemed to relax just a little. Ethan sat down across from it, keeping his posture non-threatening. Hours passed, and the storm outside raged, shaking the walls and rattling the equipment. But inside, there was a fragile calm. Ethan tried to communicate, using simple words, gestures, and sketches. He drew pictures in the dust on a metal panel, showing himself, the shelter, and the storm outside. The alien watched, fascinated, and eventually began to make small marks of its own. It was a crude conversation, but it was enough for them to understand that they were both intelligent, both trying to survive. The alien finally spoke, not in words Ethan could understand, but in a series of clicks, hums, and soft tones. He repeated the sounds back, trying to mimic them as best he could. The alien tilted its head, seemingly pleased, and repeated some of the sounds. It was a small victory, a bridge forming between two very different beings. As the storm outside continued to batter the desert, Ethan learned more about the alien. Its name was Lyra, though he had to approximate the sounds. Lyra's people had lived in a distant settlement, far from the human colonies, and had been caught by surprise when the storm swept through. Her companions had been lost, scattered, or killed by the violent weather. She had fled alone, carried by instinct and desperation, until she found Ethan's shelter. Ethan felt a pang of sympathy. He knew what it was like to be alone on this harsh world. Survival here required more than strength. It required patience, careful observation, and ingenuity. He realized that while Lyra feared humans, she also needed them to survive, just as he needed her cooperation to navigate this strange encounter. Hours passed. The storm began to lose some of its intensity, though it still raged with unpredictable energy. Ethan prepared a small corner with blankets and heated panels to help Lyra rest. She hesitated at first, then curled into herself cautiously, finally closing her eyes. Ethan sat nearby, watching her. Despite the strangeness of the situation, he felt a sense of connection. Here, in the middle of a hostile desert on a distant planet, two beings from entirely different worlds had found shelter together. He understood the fragility of trust and the importance of respect. As night fell, the storm began to fade, leaving the desert quiet but still alien and dangerous. Ethan allowed himself a moment to relax, but he kept one eye on Lyra. Tomorrow would bring challenges, food, navigation, and communication. But for now, they had survived the first night together. Ethan reflected on the events. The desert had brought them together, but it was their choices that would determine what came next. Could a human and an alien, so different in every way, work together? Could trust grow where fear had ruled for so long? He did not know, but for the first time since arriving on Aridex 7, he felt hope, not just for survival but for something more. Outside, the wind still whispered through the dunes, carrying sand and secrets across the endless desert. Inside, a fragile light of understanding flickered between two very different beings. Neither of them could predict the future, but they had taken the first step toward it. And in a world as unforgiving as this, that step was everything. The night passed slowly, punctuated by the occasional roar of distant thunder. Ethan stayed awake for long stretches, listening, observing, and learning. Lyra occasionally murmured soft tones in her language, sometimes accompanied by gestures, and Ethan listened carefully, trying to decipher meaning. Each small attempt at understanding was a victory, each moment of calm a triumph over the storm outside. By the time the first faint light of dawn colored the horizon, the storm had passed. Dust hung in the air, and the desert seemed eerily still. Ethan knew the calm was temporary. Survival here would require vigilance, cooperation, and courage, but he also knew that the first test had been passed. They had found shelter together, and in doing so, they had begun a fragile bond that might grow into something far greater than mere survival. For now, the desert remained vast and dangerous, but inside the small shelter, a human and an alien had learned the simplest, yet most important lesson. They were not alone. The dawn light filtered weakly through the dusty air, painting the desert in shades of muted gold and brown. The storm had passed, but its aftermath left the landscape unstable and unpredictable. Ethan stepped out of the shelter first, surveying the dunes with a careful eye. The storm had shifted the sand, forming new ridges and covering familiar markers. He marked the path mentally, knowing that every step across this alien desert required caution. Lyra stirred behind him, rising slowly from her resting place. She seemed hesitant to leave the shelter, her large eyes taking in the wreckage of the desert. She had never seen a human in this kind of environment before, let alone one who could survive such conditions. There was curiosity in her gaze, mixed with the caution that came from centuries of stories warning her people about humans. Ethan turned to her with a gentle smile. "It's safe now," he said softly. "The storm has passed, but the desert can still be dangerous. We'll stay close to the shelter today." Lyra tilted her head, her body language tense yet curious. She did not speak in words Ethan could understand, but she made a series of soft clicks and hums that seemed to express a mix of gratitude and uncertainty. Ethan had been practicing mimicking her sounds since last night, and he repeated them back, trying to show he was listening and willing to communicate. The alien blinked slowly, a gesture Ethan took as a sign of acknowledgement. She stepped closer, her movements graceful yet cautious. Together, they began the process of organizing the shelter's supplies, something Ethan thought essential before attempting any exploration. He wanted Lyra to feel included, to understand that cooperation was necessary for both of them to survive. Ethan began by arranging food and water. He knew that Lyra's physiology was different from humans, but he had some supplies that might work. He handed her a small container filled with a nutrient paste he had designed for human rations in extreme conditions. She sniffed it first, eyes narrowing, then tasted it carefully. After a brief hesitation, she accepted more, allowing herself to eat openly. "Good," Ethan said quietly. "You need energy. We'll both need it if we're going to survive the desert." Lyra's eyes softened slightly, a small sign of trust. She moved to help Ethan organize the remaining supplies, though she did so with caution. Ethan noted her careful movements, her precision, and the way she seemed to study his methods. There was intelligence here, a sharpness that reminded him that her people were survivors too. Once the supplies were arranged, Ethan decided to attempt more communication. He pulled out a small, portable tablet and drew basic shapes and symbols, illustrating their shelter, the desert outside, and the dangers of storms. Lyra watched intently, then reached out with one of her long, slender fingers to trace the shapes. She made marks of her own, curving lines and symbols that he could not yet understand. "This is how we can learn from each other," Ethan said. "We can show, we can draw. It's slow, but it works." Lyra tilted her head again, and this time she repeated one of the shapes back to him. It was a small victory, a simple gesture that bridged their worlds. Ethan allowed himself a smile. He could feel a bond beginning to form, fragile and tentative, but real nonetheless. After a while, Ethan stood and pointed to the horizon. "We need to explore soon," he said. "We have to know what's safe and what's dangerous. If we wait too long, scavengers or predators could appear." Lyra hesitated. She had never ventured far from her settlement without others of her kind. Her eyes flicked between Ethan and the desert, uncertainty and fear visible in every movement. Ethan crouched to her level, speaking softly. "I'll go with you. We'll stay together. You're not alone." The alien's posture softened slightly. She seemed to consider his words, then gave a small nod. With that, they stepped outside, the bright light of the morning sun casting long shadows across the sand. The desert was quiet now, almost eerily so. The storm had left tracks, twisted dunes, and scattered debris. Ethan led the way, carefully choosing his steps, while Lyra followed, her gaze scanning the horizon for dangers he could not see. She seemed to rely on senses beyond human capability. She noticed small movements in the distance, subtle shifts in the sand, and the faint scent of distant creatures. Ethan realized that her abilities complemented his own knowledge and preparation. Together, they were stronger. As they moved, Ethan began to speak of humans, not just as individuals but as a species. He described the challenges humans had faced on Earth: harsh climates, natural disasters, conflicts, and the ways people had adapted and survived. He spoke slowly, using simple words, and accompanied them with gestures and drawings in the sand. Lyra listened, tilting her head, making small sounds that Ethan tried to interpret. He wanted her to understand that humans were not the monsters of legend, the destructive beings her people had feared. Humans were resourceful, resilient, and capable of kindness and courage. Slowly, she began to seem more relaxed in his presence, observing him not with fear, but with cautious interest. They paused near a small ridge, overlooking a section of desert where the sand had shifted dramatically. Lightning had struck a rock formation, leaving a jagged scar in the landscape. Ethan gestured toward it, then drew lines in the sand to show what had happened. Lyra watched intently, tracing the shapes with her finger. "It's dangerous," Ethan said. "Storms can change everything. You have to be careful. We have to know what's safe." Lyra's eyes followed his gestures. She made a soft hum, then pointed to the horizon where a faint movement caught her attention. Ethan looked, seeing nothing at first. Then a small creature scuttled across the sand, its shape barely visible. Ethan smiled. "Exactly. That's why we move carefully. Every step matters." As the sun climbed higher, they returned to the shelter to rest and recover from the morning's exertion. Ethan had noticed that Lyra seemed tired, her breathing shallow, her movements slower. Inside, he adjusted the temperature and offered her water again. She drank cautiously, then relaxed into a corner of the shelter, observing him while he worked on equipment and notes. "You're learning," Ethan said quietly. "Not just about me, but about humans, and I'm learning from you too." Lyra's ears, or the structures Ethan assumed were ears, twitched slightly, and she made a sound that he took as acknowledgement. There was a rhythm to their interaction, a dance of communication slowly forming. Ethan realized that trust did not come quickly or easily, but it could grow with patience and consistency. He spent the afternoon showing her tools and equipment, demonstrating how each worked, how humans used ingenuity to overcome challenges. Lyra watched carefully, occasionally reaching out to test something herself. She seemed fascinated by the mechanical simplicity and elegance of some devices and the complex ingenuity of others. "Humans survive by learning," Ethan said. "We make mistakes, we try again, and we adapt. You can do the same. Together, we can survive this desert." Lyra made a soft sound, almost like a whisper, and repeated one of Ethan's gestures back to him. It was progress, slow but undeniable. Ethan felt a surge of hope. For centuries, her people had feared humans. Yet here, in this small shelter, trust was beginning to replace fear. As evening approached, Ethan prepared a small meal for both of them. Lyra watched as he worked, then carefully assisted, showing a skill with precision that impressed him. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the gentle hum of the shelter's systems and the occasional distant rumble of a settling storm. Afterward, they sat together, looking out through the reinforced windows at the desert beyond. The sky was painted in shades of orange and red, the horizon glowing with the last light of day. Ethan spoke quietly, telling Lyra stories of Earth, its oceans, forests, and mountains. He described the ingenuity of humans in building cities, exploring space, and surviving in harsh conditions. Lyra listened, captivated by the images he painted with words and gestures. "You see," Ethan said finally, "humans are not just strong, we're adaptable. We care for others, and we can survive almost anything if we work together." Lyra looked at him, her eyes reflecting the fading light. She made a sound, soft and deliberate, then reached out to touch his hand briefly. It was a gesture of trust, a silent acknowledgement that she was beginning to see humans in a new light. Night fell over the desert, calm now after the storm's fury. Ethan and Lyra settled in for the evening, each in their own space but close enough to feel the presence of the other. The bond between them was fragile but growing, built on survival, understanding, and mutual respect. As Ethan drifted into a light sleep, he reflected on the day. Communication had been slow, trust had been tested, but progress had been made. Lyra had begun to see that humans could be allies, protectors, and companions, not just threats. And Ethan had begun to see that this alien was not merely a survivor but a being of intelligence, grace, and courage. Outside, the desert was silent, yet the world was still alive. The lessons of the storm lingered in the air, the importance of caution, of cooperation, and of understanding. Inside the shelter, two very different beings had begun a fragile partnership. It was the beginning of a journey that would test them both, challenge their assumptions, and ultimately reveal the strengths of humanity in the face of the unknown. The night was long, but it passed without incident. By morning, Ethan and Lyra would be ready to face the desert again, each step bringing them closer to survival, understanding, and perhaps even friendship. Morning came quietly on Aridex 7. The desert no longer screamed with wind or lightning, but silence here was never safe. Ethan woke before the sun fully rose, his instincts trained by weeks of survival on the planet. He checked the shelter systems first, power steady, air clean, water levels stable. Then his eyes moved to Lyra. She was awake already. She stood near the reinforced window, watching the dunes as light slowly spilled across them. Her posture was alert, tense, like a creature that knew danger could appear at any moment. When Ethan moved, she turned her head slightly, acknowledging him without fear. That small change meant more to him than words ever could. "Today will be harder," Ethan said calmly, "but we'll manage." Lyra listened, her eyes following his mouth as he spoke. She did not understand the words fully, but she understood tone. He was not afraid, that mattered. Ethan prepared gear carefully. He packed water, emergency tools, signal beacons, and portable scanners. He hesitated for a moment, then handed Lyra a lightweight protective wrap designed for sand and heat. She examined it closely, then wrapped it around her body in a way that fit her form better than he expected. She was learning fast. He pointed toward the horizon and then toward the shelter, drawing a simple path in the sand. He made a circle around the shelter, then marked several nearby areas. "We go out," he explained slowly, "but we come back." Lyra made a soft tone and repeated the circle motion with her finger. Agreement. They stepped outside together. The desert looked different after the storm. Familiar dunes were gone, replaced by sharp ridges and deep troughs. Some areas were packed hard, others loose and dangerous. Ethan moved carefully, testing each step. Lyra moved differently, lighter, faster, but she stayed close. As they traveled, Ethan noticed how often Lyra paused, listening to things he could not hear. Once, she raised her hand suddenly. Ethan stopped immediately. Seconds later, the sand ahead shifted. A long, armored creature burst from beneath the surface and fled away from them, disturbed by their presence. Ethan exhaled slowly. "You saved us," he said. Lyra looked at him, then at the retreating creature. She made a short sound and tapped the side of her head, then the ground. She was showing him how she sensed vibrations. Ethan nodded, committing it to memory. They continued. By midday, the heat was intense. Ethan adjusted their route to pass between rock formations that offered some shade. He noticed Lyra slowing slightly, her movements less fluid. Without hesitation, he stopped and unpacked water. "Rest," he said, sitting down himself. Lyra hesitated, then mirrored his action. She drank carefully, watching him the entire time. Ethan realized something important then. She was not just observing his actions. She was studying his decisions. After resting, they climbed a low ridge. On the other side, Ethan froze. The remains of a settlement lay scattered across the sand. Broken structures, half-buried equipment, and fragments of unfamiliar technology stretched across the valley below. Ethan did not need to ask whose settlement this was. Lyra made a low, broken sound. She moved forward slowly, each step heavy. Ethan followed at a respectful distance. The settlement was destroyed completely. Whatever storm had passed through here had not spared anything. Lyra knelt beside a shattered structure and touched it gently. Her shoulders lowered and her movements became slow, careful. Ethan stayed silent. He knew grief did not need words. After a long moment, Lyra stood and looked at him. Her eyes were filled not with fear now, but with something deeper, loss mixed with determination. She pointed to the ruins, then to herself, then to Ethan. Then she spread her hands outward. Ethan understood. "Survivors," he said quietly. "We look for survivors." Together they searched. They moved through the wreckage methodically. Ethan used scanners to detect life signs. Lyra used her senses to listen for faint sounds or movement. They worked without speaking, a silent partnership forming naturally. They found none. But they did find supplies, sealed containers, intact tools, and energy cells that could still be used. Ethan carefully sorted what was safe to carry. Lyra helped, lifting objects heavier than she looked capable of carrying. As the sun began to dip, Ethan noticed movement on the edge of the valley. He froze. Three shapes moved across the sand, tall, lean predators drawn by the scent of disturbance. Their bodies were low to the ground, eyes fixed forward. Lyra noticed them at the same time. She made a sharp sound and backed toward Ethan. Ethan did not panic. He reached into his pack and activated a signal emitter, setting it to a frequency known to disturb local wildlife. A low hum filled the air. The creatures hesitated but did not retreat. Ethan quickly adjusted the frequency, then placed the emitter on a rock and activated a visual flare. Bright light flashed suddenly, reflecting off the sand and rock. The predators recoiled, confused. Lyra watched, stunned. Ethan took her hand gently and guided her backward, moving slowly, never turning their backs. When the creatures finally fled, Ethan shut down the emitter and let out a slow breath. "We're okay," he said. Lyra stared at him. Her gaze was no longer cautious or uncertain. It was filled with something new, respect. They returned to the shelter before nightfall, carrying what they could. Once inside, Ethan secured the hatch and checked the perimeter. Only then did he allow himself to relax. Lyra stood near him, still watching. Ethan set the recovered supplies down and sat heavily against the wall. The day had taken its toll. He wiped sweat from his face and laughed quietly, more from relief than humor. "That was close," he said. Lyra made a sound that almost resembled laughter. It was softer, lighter than the others she had made before. That night, communication came easier. Lyra drew symbols on the floor, patterns that represented her people, their cities, their way of life. Ethan responded with drawings of Earth, human shelters, ships, and stars. They pointed, corrected each other, and shared meaning piece by piece. At one point, Lyra drew a simple shape, a figure standing alone in a storm. Then she added another beside it. Ethan felt his chest tighten. "Yes," he said softly, "together." She touched her chest, then his, then placed her hand between them. "Trust." Later, as the shelter lights dimmed, Ethan lay awake thinking. Humans had survived countless harsh worlds. not because they were the strongest or the fastest, but because they adapted, learned, and helped others. Today had proven that again. Lyra had feared humans. Her people had believed humans were dangerous. But today, a human had stood between her and predators. A human had guided her through ruins. A human had treated her loss with respect. And she had saved him too. Outside, the desert shifted quietly under the stars. The world was still dangerous. The future was still uncertain. But something had changed. By surviving together, they had proven something important, not just about humans, but about what could happen when fear gave way to cooperation. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The shelter could not protect them forever. Others might come, human teams, alien survivors, or worse. But for now, Ethan knew one thing for certain. Humanity did not survive by standing alone, and neither did anyone else. The morning sun rose over the desert, casting long shadows across the sand dunes. The storm from days before had left the landscape altered, forming new ridges and burying familiar landmarks. Ethan stood at the entrance of the shelter, scanning the horizon with a practiced eye. Every movement of the wind, every ripple in the sand could signal danger. He was alert but also calm. He had learned to read this harsh world. Lyra emerged behind him, moving cautiously but confidently. She had grown more comfortable around Ethan in the past few days. The trust that had begun in the shelter was now tested in the open desert, and she stepped carefully, following his lead. Her long limbs carried her gracefully across the uneven sand, her eyes constantly observing. Ethan noticed how her senses detected things he could not, subtle changes in the wind, faint tracks of creatures, even the distant echoes of shifting dunes. "We need to move carefully today," Ethan said softly, "but we also need to find a safe place for water and food. The storm may have left some supplies behind, but we have to be prepared." Lyra made a small sound, a soft hum that Ethan had come to recognize as agreement. She gestured toward the horizon, pointing at a faint glimmer that could have been sunlight reflecting off metal or water. Ethan nodded, appreciating her instincts. He began to walk and she followed, matching her pace to his. The desert stretched endlessly, a vast sea of sand and rock. Ethan and Lyra moved slowly, stepping carefully over dunes and around sharp rock formations. They communicated with gestures and simple words, using the signs they had practiced together. Each small victory in communication made the journey smoother and strengthened their bond. After some time, they came across the remnants of what appeared to have been a small settlement. Partially buried under sand and debris, it was clear that the storm had destroyed everything. Broken structures, twisted metal, and scattered supplies littered the area. Ethan signaled for caution. "We don't know if anything or anyone is still here," he said. Lyra scanned the area, moving with precision. Her senses detected faint signs of movement, small creatures that had survived, but no immediate threats from larger predators. She gestured toward a cluster of partially buried crates, and Ethan nodded. Together, they carefully dug through the sand, uncovering supplies that could be salvaged. Water, food rations, and basic tools would be critical for their survival. "This will help us," Ethan said, organizing the supplies. "We need to keep moving, but at least we have some resources now." Lyra made a soft sound, almost like a whisper, and repeated one of Ethan's gestures, signaling understanding. She then pointed toward the horizon again, indicating that they should continue. They had to be cautious. The desert was unpredictable, and danger could come from anywhere. As they walked, Ethan began to teach Lyra more about human survival strategies. He showed her how to read the patterns in the sand, how to find signs of water, and how to recognize safe paths. Lyra observed closely, her movements precise and calculated. She began to adopt some of his methods, combining them with her own instincts. Together they were a team, each complementing the other's abilities. Hours passed as they crossed the dunes. The sun climbed higher, making the sand hot and difficult to traverse. Ethan kept an eye on Lyra, noticing when she slowed or showed signs of fatigue. He offered her water and encouraged her to rest when needed. She accepted, her trust in him evident in the way she allowed him to care for her. Suddenly, Lyra stopped, her body tense. She raised a hand and made a sound that Ethan recognized as a warning. He froze, scanning the desert. At first he saw nothing, but then he noticed movement, a group of desert predators, sleek and fast, stalking across the sand toward them. Ethan assessed the situation quickly. "We need to move," he said. "Stay close, follow my lead." Lyra nodded, her body coiled like a spring. Ethan led them across the dunes, using his knowledge of the terrain to stay out of reach of the predators. Lyra's agility and heightened senses helped them avoid danger, but the creatures were fast and persistent. Ethan used his tools, a portable flare and a small signal device, to distract them, giving them an advantage. The predators hesitated, confused by the sudden light and sound, and Ethan and Lyra took the opportunity to sprint toward a rocky outcrop. They reached the relative safety of the rocks, panting and covered in sand but unharmed. Ethan turned to Lyra, giving her an approving nod. "Good work. We made it." Lyra's eyes softened, and she made a series of soft sounds that Ethan interpreted as relief and gratitude. She had faced danger before, but working together with a human had been a new experience. The trust between them had been tested, and they had survived. They rested briefly, catching their breath and scanning the desert. Ethan took a moment to reflect on the journey so far. The storm had brought them together, but it was their cooperation and trust that had allowed them to survive the challenges that followed. Lyra had begun to see humans not as threats, but as capable, resourceful beings. After the brief rest, they continued their journey. They reached a small valley, sheltered by rocky cliffs, where a thin stream of water trickled through the sand. Ethan smiled. "This will work," he said. "We can rest here and we can find food and water." Lyra approached the stream cautiously, dipping a finger into the water to test it. She made a sound of approval, and Ethan nodded. Together, they drank and replenished their supplies. The valley offered a temporary sanctuary, a place to recover and plan their next steps. As the day passed, Ethan and Lyra worked together to gather resources and fortify their position. Ethan showed her how to use simple traps to catch small creatures for food, while Lyra used her agility to scout the surrounding area for signs of danger. Their skills complemented each other perfectly, and their trust continued to grow. In the evening, Ethan built a small fire, the warm light contrasting with the cool desert air. He shared stories of human exploration and survival, speaking slowly so Lyra could follow. She listened intently, occasionally making sounds or gestures to ask questions. Ethan responded, using simple words and gestures to explain. Lyra began to mimic some of his gestures, and Ethan smiled. Communication was no longer just about survival, it was becoming a bond. They were learning from each other, understanding each other, and forming a partnership that went beyond the immediate need for survival. As night fell, the desert became quiet. The predators of the day had retreated, and the air was still, except for the faint whisper of wind through the rocks. Ethan and Lyra sat together, sharing warmth from the fire. There was a sense of peace, a rare moment in a harsh and unforgiving world. Ethan reflected on the journey. They had faced storms, scarcity, and predators, yet they had survived. Lyra had begun to trust him, and he had begun to understand her. Together, they had formed a partnership that neither had expected. Lyra made a soft sound, reaching out to touch Ethan's hand briefly. It was a gesture of trust and acknowledgement, a silent promise that they would continue to work together. Ethan smiled, squeezing her hand gently in return. They were no longer just two beings caught in a desert. They were a team, united by circumstance and strengthened by cooperation. The night passed quietly. Ethan and Lyra took turns keeping watch, ensuring that any dangers could be met with preparation rather than surprise. The bond between them grew stronger, built on trust, understanding, and shared experience. By dawn, they were ready to continue their journey. The desert was still vast and unpredictable, but they had learned that together they could face its challenges. Each step forward was a testament to human ingenuity, courage, and the ability to inspire trust and cooperation even across the greatest differences. As they prepared to leave the valley, Ethan looked at Lyra and smiled. "We've made it this far. We'll keep going together. No matter what comes next, we'll face it as a team." Lyra made a soft sound, echoing his sentiment. She followed him closely as they stepped out of the valley, ready to continue their journey across the desert. Each dune, each ridge, and each challenge was an opportunity to learn, to survive, and to strengthen the bond they had formed. The sun rose higher, casting bright light across the sand. The desert was harsh, but it was also alive with possibility. Ethan and Lyra moved forward, side by side, facing whatever the world had in store. They had survived the storm, and they had survived the desert. Together, they would continue to survive, and in doing so, they would prove that trust, cooperation, and courage could bridge even the widest gaps between worlds. Hours turned into days, and the duo continued their journey, encountering both challenges and small victories. They discovered hidden water sources, avoided dangerous creatures, and shared knowledge about the terrain. Each success reinforced their trust in one another, and each obstacle reminded them of the importance of teamwork. Eventually, they reached the outskirts of a larger, more fertile valley. Evidence of past settlements hinted at the presence of others, perhaps humans, perhaps other aliens. Ethan paused, scanning the horizon carefully. "We're not alone," he said. "We'll need to approach carefully, but this could be a safe place." Lyra tilted her head, alert and cautious. Ethan gestured for her to stay close, and together they moved forward, ready to explore the valley and the possibilities it held. The journey had tested them in every way, but it had also taught them that together, they were capable of more than either could have imagined alone. As they stepped into the valley, the desert behind them seemed to shrink, its harshness softened by the promise of water, shelter, and potential allies. Ethan and Lyra paused, taking in the view. The future was uncertain, but for the first time it felt full of hope. Ethan spoke softly, almost to himself. "We've come far, Lyra, and we'll go farther still." Lyra made a sound, a soft echo of agreement, and together they moved into the valley, ready to face whatever came next. The storm had brought them together, the desert had tested them, and now the wider world awaited. But with trust, courage, and cooperation, they knew they could face anything. And so, side by side, human and alien ventured forward, stepping into the unknown with hope, determination, and a bond that had been forged in the crucible of survival. "She fled the storm into my shelter, then stopped cold at the sight of a human,"